This is episode 523 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am very pleased to be joined this week by Jarrett Skorup. He is the vice president for marketing communications at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy. That is the Michigan version of the Rio Grande Foundation, although much bigger organization and one of the granddaddies of the free market think tank movement. Jarrett's worked in various roles at Mackinac since 2009, and most recently, at least as far as we're concerned here, wrote a research paper called The Janus Effect, the impact of the 2018 Supreme Court decision on public sector unions. So we're going to talk a lot about the Janus decision at the Supreme Court and other related issues. But welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico, Jarrett.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so we worked together, kind of, I don't know about in the before Janus environment, but certainly post-Janus with regard to issues of public sector unions. But if folks haven't been following this show or kind of the public sector union issue, let's talk about what the Janus decision at the U.S. Supreme Court was, and how it affected states, including Michigan, I guess, then and now, and New Mexico consistently throughout. But what's this Janus decision all about?
Sure, it's a pretty simple decision. It essentially held that all public sector workers, anyone that works for the government, which is mostly teachers, state employees, local government, police, fire, that kind of thing, are right to work employees. So it said that anybody that worked for the government, if you can choose to join and pay dues or fees to the union, or you can choose to not join or pay fees to the union. And this decision was anticipated back in 2018 because the year before that, the Supreme Court took a few years before that, they took on a very similar case, but Justice Scalia had died, and so they split 4-4 on it. And so it was kind of, if the case came up again, it was kind of dependent on who was the Supreme Court justice. And at the time, if people recall, President Trump somewhat unexpectedly won the election, nominated his Justice Gorsuch. And so we were anticipating that decision, which was, in our opinion, a long time coming. And I remember sitting down with you, Paul, and others kind of talking about this for these states that had heavy union membership, but might be interested in a new right to work environment.
Yeah. And, the Supreme Court, and I know you're not an attorney, nor am I, but basically the gist was that the Supreme Court said it was against free speech that you would have to, as a government employee, pay union dues, pay to a private organization that you may not share the views of. It's really a violation of the First Amendment. Now, New Mexico remains non-right to work when it comes to the private sector, and same now for Mackinac, and that's something we can get into a little bit later. But Michigan, the names are so similar, but Michigan was a right to work state, but is no longer. And
well, for a couple more months. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, definitely we want to get into that a little bit, but why did the court, in your estimation, make the distinction there between private sector and public sector? What's the legal argument there?
Yeah, great question. Well, the key one is that constitutional rights only apply to the government. And so when in this case, my father was a public school teacher when the Janus decision went through, and what was happening was the government had passed a law saying, okay, public school districts, as part of your contracts, you can force people to pay money to essentially support political beliefs that you oppose and political organizations. And so you do have more leeway when it's the private sector. If you work for a private employer, there's more of an argument over, you have choice in who you work for. You have the opportunity to work other places. You obviously have that in the government, but the government cannot, through its own entities, force people to adopt certain political positions. And that's what was happening. And the court had taken up series of these cases over the decades. And they'd always tried to kind of split the baby on that, for lack of a better term, but ultimately said every part of what unions advocate for at the local contract level and with political spending is political activity, which means it's political speech, which means the government cannot be in the role of forcing them to pay for it.
Yeah, and traditionally, even Franklin Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, opposed the idea of allowing government employees to be union members. He said basically that unionization simply didn't apply the same way towards government as it did in the private sector. And it wasn't until John F. Kennedy that was changed by an executive order. Now, most people think Kennedy kind of almost a conservative, maybe a modern day Republican, but certainly on this particular issue, he came down to the left of none other than Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Yeah, and that was more of a policy idea rather than the constitutional one, where FDR, like a lot of kind of principled leftists at the time, said it's impossible for the government to collectively bargain with a union because the government is there to set rules and work conditions and needs to get things done. This isn't like General Motors where, if the factory shuts down for a while, that there's some hardship, but it's not endangering a child's education by shutting down schools. It's not endangering national defense if the Army was to unionize. There's these unique things that the government does that collective bargaining does not make a lot of sense for. But he lost that argument, and here we are.
Yeah. Now, we worked together. That is Rio Grande Foundation and the Mackinac Center. Of course, two free market think tanks, but numerous other organizations across the country worked to educate union members about the Janus decision in the wake of that decision. And, you were kind of the point person nationally. Can you talk about kind of the scope of this project and what we were engaged in? Because nobody, people think, oh, the Supreme Court says this. And if you're really engaged in you're kind of tracking the news, what happened. And I'm sure a lot of union members did track this decision and acted accordingly in the wake of the Janus decision. But you'd be surprised how many people kind of don't really follow or know what's going on and know their rights. So we did, the basic work of education. So talk about that project and specifically what we did here in New Mexico, but across the country as well. Yeah.
So a little bit of history of how I got into this. So Michigan became a right to work state back in 2012. And so we were excited here at Mackinac. We think that law is good policy, and that was for public and private sector workers. And so we said, great. We worked hard. We had produced research papers thinking it would have good economic effects. And then a year after Michigan became a right to work state, we kind of looked into the union membership numbers and found that the largest union in the state had lost fewer than 1% of its members. And we thought, man, that's interesting. Why is that? And the more we dug into it, it was there were legal obstacles the unions were trying to put in place to avoid that law. But more importantly, very few people knew about it. And my boss likes to say, freedom is not self-executing, which is that people actually have to know about their rights in order to exercise them. And so we began doing a marketing campaign and working with coalitions just to tell people what their rights actually were here in Michigan. And you began seeing very high opt-out rates. About a third of union members in Michigan have opted out of their unions. And so in anticipation of that for the Janus decision, we did not want that to happen again. And so we met with lots of groups and individuals across the country, especially people like you, Paul, who were in these states that had not been right to work. And maybe they had public employees that were not aware that this law was coming, didn't know what it meant. were confused about it. We had gotten thousands of questions from people. Okay, if I opt out of my union, does that mean my pay gets cut? Do I lose my pension? What actually happens? And so we were teaming up with groups just to do the education, to find public employees. I know we had a few in New Mexico willing to share their stories, to make videos, and to actually get the word out on that. And I think it was very successful, especially in New Mexico, where it's a little bit of a smaller state, smaller market.
Yeah, and let's get into your policy paper, which of course the Janus decision came down in 2018. So you kind of wrote this research document in celebration of that 5th anniversary, and you go through a lot of different data points, but specifically New Mexico does come up. But broadly speaking, what were you trying to get across, and tell people how they can find this research paper as well?
Sure. Yeah. So our website's mackinac.org. If you go there, you'll find the paper. And what has kind of come up over the last couple of years, and even as the decision was going through, there was, leading up to the decision, the labor unions were saying this will devastate us. This will be really bad for us. The court shouldn't rule that people have the freedom to leave. After the decision, they changed their tune and said, decision is not that important. It's energized our members, and we think everyone's going to be really excited when they find out what union membership means. And so there's been different ways that reporters and researchers have tried to track, how do we actually track union membership? And the main way is the federal government, through the Bureau of Labor Statistics, does survey data. And then there's also these union reports that unions filed, but most unions do not have to file those membership reports. And so if you look at the federal survey data, it's really poorly done. It's 2 questions that are tacked onto the Census Bureau, and they're pretty confusing. They ask if people are union members, and they also ask if they work somewhere that's covered by a collective bargaining agreement. If you ask someone like my dad, are you a union member? He would have always said, I think he would have always said yes, because he would have said, I'm a public school teacher. I work somewhere with a collective bargaining agreement. Even though he ultimately did resign from union membership, he would not have understood really what that meant. And we see that in those survey data, that there's these contradictory answers, subject to kind of these jagged swings. It doesn't do a great job measuring union membership. And then the union filings that they file with the federal government, like I said, most unions don't have to file those. And so you only get kind of a tiny sample to look at that. Either way, both of those do show drops in union membership since the decision. We developed a third way of tracking this, which is to go directly to the public employers and file public records requests. And so we went to all the 22 states affected by Janus. We filed public records requests with their largest public entities, which is typically the state, the state of wherever they're at, and then the largest school districts, cities, counties, and if they have a large university system. And so we're able to look at the overall percent of people who are opting out of their union membership, and we're able to look at that on a state by state level to kind of do our own survey of the results. And that's what the report is. And we estimate that about a little bit more than 20% of workers have ultimately opted out of their unions across the states affected by the Janus decision.
Now it's, you kind of alluded to it, that people involved with unions kind of had both perspectives. There was some that said it was going to devastate the unions, and there were some that said, oh, people love their unions. Why would they ever leave those organizations that supposedly stand up for their rights, this, that, and the other thing? So where do you see this overall decline in membership on that spectrum?
Yeah, so New Mexico in general has a very high, that's the highest opt-out rate that we've seen, more than 60%. And then among larger states, California has a high opt-out rate. Pennsylvania is a pretty high opt-out rate. New Jersey is a pretty high opt-out rate. One of the things that we see across these sectors is that the states that have So like New Mexico is a relatively small state. The public sector workers, a huge percentage of them are state workers. And so state workers tend to have the highest opt-out rate. The reason for that is probably because they're in a centralized system, payroll system. And also states they have legal staff. They're pretty wary of the Janus decision. One of the things the Janus decision said is that workers need to provide affirmative consent to remain in a union. So it seems that states tended to be pretty good about letting people know you do have the right to opt out, and they process those opt-outs pretty quickly. And New Mexico, in some of the states we've seen high opt-out rates, they tend to have a very high percentage of state workers. And then you are seeing high opt-outs in the school districts in New Mexico. We just got some results back the other day. We're continuing to track this, that the city of Santa Fe, more than half of their union members, people covered by collective bargaining agreements, have opted out. So New Mexico is one where people are exercising those rights.
Yeah, and just to put a little meat on the bones, in your paper, you describe, the states that were not right to work, because if you already were right to work, then your state was completely unaffected by Janus, more or less. New Mexico, 61.9% drop from 31,785 total workers covered by union contracts to 12,102 total union members after Janus. The only state that came even close to that in terms of a drop was Colorado, which lost about 50% of union members. Other states, like you said, were kind of all over the place. But I do want to try to pin you down on the broader issue. Is this decision in 5 years of retrospect, is it devastating to unions as a whole, or is it something that really they're kind of sloughing off and kind of moving on with their political activities and their financial influence in American politics?
Man, it's a great question, and to me, the question will be on how active unions remain on the political side. Even in Michigan, where they've had a tremendous amount of membership loss, they're still politically powerful. However, we are seeing things like the Atlantic wrote a story in Michigan on our last gubernatorial election, where they noted that unions, the tremendous loss of membership has meant they are spending less on politics. They are less involved in politics. You have things like environmental groups that are a little bit more of the bigger players. And I expect that that's what we'll see. At the very least, unions cannot take it for granted that, obviously you could force your more conservative members to pay, whether they agree to your politics or not. The question that's going to be on my mind going forward is there are some unions who've responded to this by becoming less political. The SEIU in California, which saw a big drop in membership after Janus, said they got a new president who came in and said, I'm not going to spend money on this political stuff. We don't have time for that. We're going to spend the money on bargaining. Are unions going to go that route, or are they going to double down and say, yeah, we have a smaller group of people, but they're more active, they're more liberal. They want us to be more willing to call strikes and things like that. And I think we just don't know that yet. I think we need another election cycle or two before we figure that out.
No, that's a fair point. It's if you look at New Mexico politics, for example, it's hard to see any shift being driven by this change with the unions. New Mexico's certainly not moved at all to the political right over the last 5 years, and there's a lot of different factors involved there. The unions, public sector unions, are a major special interest group, but they're by no means the only part of the Democrat coalition that kind of has a lot of money and resources, and it seems like the unions still have a pretty big say in this area. So, and of course, there's been 5 years of stuff happening, and COVID certainly played a role in the unions, especially the education unions. I think it's not just us radical libertarian conservatives who kind of see the education unions as more of a problem. There's a lot of parents and maybe even some members of those unions that see those organizations as being a little less ideal than maybe they were several years ago.
Yeah, well, the one thing too is we've had COVID in the 5 years since Janus, and there's two parts of that. The one side is how schools are being managed and waking up a lot of parents and policymakers to, man, the public sector unions are really calling the shots here in some ways that I might not like if they had young kids that they wanted in school, for example. But on the other hand, we've just had huge increases in government spending pretty much across the board. And so when that happens, you really don't have, everyone can kind of be on the same page. New Mexico can be a Democratic state, but there's no real, the controversy is how do we spend all this money we've been getting? But at some point that ends. We're fiscal conservatives, the money's going to run out. And when the money runs out and push comes to shove over which interest groups do we have to choose over others, and how will they respond to that? I think that's when you're going to see some kind of gashes in this coalition. And so if New Mexico goes through a recession like everywhere else, then you're going to begin seeing how much they're giving into public sector unions versus kind of the other interests.
Yeah, that's a fascinating point. The growth of government in general, fueled by everything from those COVID bailouts to strong economic growth, fueled in part by easy money policy here in New Mexico. We've also had an influx of oil and gas revenue, so government grows and grows. It kind of can flood a little bit of that effect of the shrinking unions when government is growing just so dramatically, and it kind of highlights one of the problems I think with President Donald Trump and the Republican movements and the Republican Party is when they are fueling this growth in government, they're really fueling their political opposition in a lot of real ways.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. And once that money spigot gets shut off, then you kind of see what the coalitions of the different parties are going to be.
Yeah, and I guess we need maybe another paper. You can put it on your calendar for I guess 4.5 years from now. You can do a 10th anniversary, and we'll have a much better picture of the real impact that Janus has had.
Well, and I forgot to answer that, which is I did look at union political spending from 2016 to 2020. That's the one election cycle we did. And their unions spend about $2 billion on politics across the board. They did spend $200 million less in 2020 than they did in 2016. So there is some evidence that their political spending did go down from Janus.
Okay, well, that's a very interesting data point, and certainly that's got to be a trend that hasn't really been broken in a very long time. I'm sure and we didn't discuss this, but people who follow unionization certainly are aware that government has grown and government unions have grown within the union movement, while the private sector unions have dropped in terms of membership, and their overall impact is really relatively minimal compared to the government employee unions. But that and kind of broadly speaking, and I know you follow these issues closely, there's a lot of news stories about how unions seem to be growing. Is that something you have seen in your reading and research on this? Broadly speaking, private sector, public sector, is the decline in private sector unions staunched, as you get your Starbucks and some other organizations like that unionizing, or do you see this kind of as a very long-term proposition that private sector unions are going the way of the dodo, while government unions will still continue to grow because government's growing?
So I have done a couple of articles on that recently. What happens is somebody somewhere sexy and flashy, some company like Starbucks or fast food restaurants or they'll talk about it at Tesla. They'll talk about a unionization drive. They'll unionize a couple of Starbucks stores. They unionize a couple of Apple stores. And the media loves that because these are prominent companies and they'll do articles on it. But when you dig into the data, we're continuing to see what we've seen for a long time, which is private sector union membership continues its long time decline at a very steady rate. And what we have seen was public sector union membership increase in this country all the way up till 2010, 2011, and then partially coming out of that recession, but also prominently coming as we began getting a wave of right to work states in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in West Virginia, kind of across the Midwest and Indiana. That turned around public sector union membership, and Janus accelerated that decline. So that we have seen a decline in public sector union membership for the last decade. It accelerated under Janus, but the media kind of fixates on these couple of anecdotes. And I talked to the New York Times about this not too long ago, and I said, look, one Starbucks store with 8 people. I mean, yeah, that's a unionization, but a mid-sized school district loses more union members every single month with these opt-out rates. And so that's the big story is these big freedom of right to work at these state agencies and these local levels. And we're seeing that in the data. There's losing public sector union and private sector union members. That has continued.
All right. Well, that is good to know and very important information. All right. Let me, even though we're here in New Mexico, we've been a blue state. We've never had a Republican trifecta governor, House, and Senate since the 1930s. Michigan, though, went right to work. And then I believe you're only the second state in the history of right to work going all the way back to the Truman administration to backtrack from right to work. Normally when states go right to work, and I want to say Idaho was the only other state to backtrack, and then they eventually went back to being a right to work state. What, aside from obviously the political dynamic in Michigan, having at least temporarily moved to a blue state entirely and then repealing right to work, where is the unionization issue heading in your home state of Michigan?
Yeah, it's a good question. I wish I knew fully. So in Michigan, the Democrats took a very narrow control of the legislature, 1-seat majority in the House and the Senate. And so they had a list of things that they wanted to do. And the one that they did the most quietly was repeal right to work. And the reason they did it more quietly was that was the issue that all the polling in the state shows that our right to work law was popular. And they admitted that this was done at the behest of organized labor. Now that only, as you noted earlier, that only affects the private sector unions, which in Michigan, that's essentially means the United Auto Workers. And so it has caused a little bit of a political problem for the Democrats, which is they did this very narrowly. It was not popular. And the 2 biggest unions in the state are going through some corruption issues, which is the United Auto Workers has seen many of their top executives facing felony charges and convictions. And then also our largest teachers union was prosecuted for taking COVID dollars that it was not entitled to. And so I think that will be an issue in the next election where you're trying to benefit these 2 large funders, but who both are not spending their members' dollars very well. But it was something they wanted to do. And the reason you do that is those unions were losing $50 million in revenue every year from people who've opted out. And so that's a big chunk of change that makes up a big part of the left coalition in the state. I think there could be some political repercussions like that. It has certainly put things like right to work in our Constitution or as a ballot proposal. It's put that on the agenda of certain business groups here in the state.
Now, you alluded to a few minutes ago that there would be possible changes coming in Michigan that might result in Michigan again becoming a right-to-work state. Can you flesh that out a little bit?
Oh, well, no. So the law just hasn't gone into effect yet. They passed the law but it doesn't go into effect until next year. So that was the issue on that. There are some lawsuits potential depending on how the law gets enforced, but yeah, the law was passed this year. It just the repeal hasn't gone into effect until next year.
Okay. That's very complicated. So Michigan still technically is a right to work state. However, that will come to an end next year. What are we talking about? January 1st? Is that when your law takes effect?
It goes into place 90 days after they end the session. So we don't really know when that is, but they usually end it, in January 1st. So it would go into place in March. And again, that would be just for the private sector. We've already heard from many people very upset about that. And so you do have private sector unions that are looking to decertify their locals because most of their members have opted out of their unions. But we'll see what happens.
Yeah. Okay. So you of course have Governor Whitmer there, and then you have she just got reelected, and you've got Democrats controlling both houses of the legislature. And I presume that at least some of them will be up again in November of 2024.
Correct. Yep.
So that would be the next time it could possibly change. But what are you hearing from businesses in Michigan in terms of, are they going to just kind of stay with things there, or are they looking for other options in terms of movement? Obviously, Indiana's now a right to work state, Wisconsin, but not Ohio. Where do you see these businesses looking to deal with this issue?
Well, the auto workers, the auto companies are dealing with it the way they've dealt with it for a long time, which is they're more likely to open up a factory in a southern non-union state than they are in Michigan. We have continued to see the loss of auto jobs here in the state. That has continued. And they're in a complicated situation because they're unionized by United Auto Workers. It's a huge union. They kind of have to negotiate with them. The main way that I think this affects our state is in some of the other industries like construction. And the big construction companies were almost all very, very supportive of the right to work law. They are not happy about the repeal of right to work. I have personally heard from construction companies that have said, all right, well, we're going to move our business outside of Michigan. And having two border states, Wisconsin and Indiana, as right to work states makes that a lot easier. And I think that this has encouraged Ohio to put a right to work law on the agenda there. They do have a Republican majority. They have not been able to get right to work across the finish line. But when Michigan repeals the law, I think that it would make them more of an inviting place. But it just makes it a political fight going forward here in Michigan, which is really one of our last kind of true blue swing states. Very close presidential elections, very close House and Senate in terms of the membership.
Well, as a native Ohioan, I would love to see Ohio finally jump on the right to work bandwagon. They, of course, did undertake that a while back, and then it was beaten in a very high-profile, costly referendum campaign. And it's an issue that the broad public supports for sure. But those unions, when they organize, they have a lot of money and war chests at hand to spread a lot of information or disinformation, as the case may be, to get those dollars flowing back into their coffers. Anyway, well, anything else that we should know? Of course, your paper is really excellent. It's got a lot of great information, and I'll note that you can find it. That's for those New Mexicans. We have our own spelling eccentricities out here. A lot of Spanish words. Mackinac is MACKINAC. That's .org, and it's the Janus effect, the impact of the 2018 Supreme Court decision on public sector unions. And Jarrett wrote that paper, I'm sure, with some level of help. It's a very thoroughly researched document. But anything we missed in our conversation here that you want to make sure our listeners get before we say goodbye?
The only thing I always like to say to people is this is a First Amendment right. If you work for a government employer, you have a right to your employment. You have a right to the salary, the benefits that the government gives to all employees in your position. All that has changed is you cannot be forced to join or pay money to a labor union. And there's lots of people that make that decision for a lot of different reasons. I have multiple family members that have had to wrestle with that and make that decision. So even if you disagree and you like your union, that's great. But I do like to think that this moves us in the direction of more freedom and more respecting of people's choices.
Awesome. Well, yeah, we're glad to be number one for a change here in New Mexico. So often we're at the bottom of all the good lists, and this is a list that I definitely look at as a good list, and certainly was happy to collaborate with you and the folks at Mackinac to do some worker education and make sure that those folks knew their rights, and the fact that New Mexicans at such large majorities or large proportion of those union members felt that they weren't being well served by being a member of their union. We're glad that that is the way things worked out, and we'll just have a lot of other issues that we need to deal with here in New Mexico. But thanks for everything you've done to highlight this important issue of individual freedom, First Amendment, free speech, and worker freedom.
Thank you, Paul.
All right. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointsnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.